There comes a defining moment that changes everything, when you finally, completely choose yourself. Not when others choose you, but when you stop accommodating a world that demands your smallness. When you stop waiting for permission to become who you already are. This single decision rewrites everything that follows, not because the world shifts to accommodate you, but because you're no longer shrinking to accommodate it. Most people never make this choice. They live as supporting characters in others' stories, making decisions based on external expectations and measuring success through others' validation. In that constant outward seeking, they miss the transformative truth. The moment you choose yourself is when your real life begins. Today, I'll show you exactly how to make that choice. Over the next 50 minutes, I'm going to break down the exact mindset, the specific strategies, and the day-by-day process that transforms choosing yourself from an inspirational phrase into a lived reality. This isn't about selfishness. This is about sovereignty, taking full ownership of your time, your energy, your decisions, your direction. Because when you truly choose yourself, you don't become less available to others. You become more valuable to them. You don't become more isolated. You become more integrated. You don't become less impactful. You become unstoppable. This isn't just another video you passively consume and forget. This is a blueprint for complete transformation. Watch it multiple times. Take notes. Implement it piece by piece. Come back to it when you feel yourself slipping into old patterns. Because what I'm about to share with you isn't theory, it's strategy, battle-tested principles that have transformed thousands of lives from the foundation up, not through tricks or hacks, but through fundamental realignment of how you relate to yourself and by extension to everyone and everything around you. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you made a decision purely because it was right for you, without considering how others might judge it? When was the last time you pursued a path because it called to you, not because it would impress your peers or satisfy your parents or please your partner? When was the last time you trusted your own instincts over the collective opinion of everyone around you? If you're struggling to remember, you're not alone. Most people have outsourced their decision-making to external approval. For so long, they've forgotten what internal alignment even feels like. Here's what nobody tells you about choosing yourself. It's not a single decision, it's a complete paradigm shift. It changes how you manage your time, how you direct your energy, how you structure your priorities, how you set your boundaries, how you make your choices, both the significant ones and the seemingly insignificant ones that actually shape your daily existence. When you truly choose yourself, it's not just your actions that transform, it's your entire inner compass. You stop navigating by others' expectations and start navigating by internal congruence. The most damaging myth about choosing yourself is that it means becoming selfish, putting your needs above everyone else's, disregarding others' feelings, pursuing your desires at all costs. But true self-choice isn't selfish, it's authentic. It's not about trampling others to elevate yourself. It's about standing in your truth so completely that you inspire others to do the same. It's not about becoming cold or disconnected. It's about becoming so deeply connected to your own worth that you naturally create more meaningful connections with others. Think about the people who have most positively impacted your life. Were they people who constantly sacrificed their truth to please others? Were they people who abandoned their own needs whenever someone else expressed a preference? Were they people who diluted their power to make everyone comfortable? They were people who stood firmly in their own sovereignty. They were people who honored their gifts enough to develop them fully. They were people who respected their own boundaries enough to maintain them consistently. In choosing themselves, they became powerful enough to truly serve others. Let me introduce you to what I call the 4 pillars of self-choice, the fundamental components that transform this concept from an abstract idea into a lived reality. First, sovereign time, taking complete ownership of how your hours and days are invested rather than spent. Second, internal validation, developing an unshakable sense of your own worth independent of external feedback. Third, aligned action, ensuring that your behavior consistently reflects your true priorities rather than reactive accommodation. And fourth, boundary mastery, establishing clear delineations between what is and isn't acceptable in how you're treated. Most approaches to personal development focus on adding new behaviors, new habits, new routines. They tell you what to start doing without addressing what to stop doing. But transformation doesn't come from addition alone. It comes from subtraction, removing the patterns, the obligations, the relationships, and the beliefs that keep you tethered to old identities. Choosing yourself isn't just about what you embrace. It's about what you release. It's about what you stop tolerating, what you stop accommodating, what you stop apologizing for. And that's where we begin. The first pillar, sovereign time, starts with a radical reframing. Your time is not a resource to be managed. It's your life force to be directed. Most people treat time as something external to themselves, a neutral commodity to be allocated efficiently. But time isn't separate from you. It is you, distributed across moments, days, relationships, and pursuits. When you give your time to something or someone, you're giving a non-renewable portion of your existence. And when you truly understand this, you become extraordinarily selective about what and who receives that gift. This shift begins with what I call a time audit, a ruthless examination of how your life force is currently being distributed. For 1 week, track every hour of your day. Not in broad categories, but in specific activities. How much time are you giving to social media? To complaining about circumstances you're not changing? To people who consistently leave you drained? To obligations you've outgrown but continue from habit? This isn't about productivity, it's about alignment. It's about ensuring that your most precious resource, your life's hours, reflects what you claim to value. The results of this audit are usually shocking. Most people discover that less than 20% of their time goes to activities that genuinely energize them, develop their potential, or move them toward their most significant aspirations. The rest is consumed by low-value distractions, obligations maintained out of guilt, and relationships that offer little beyond familiar comfort. This isn't a judgment. It's an opportunity, a clear map of exactly where your power is currently being diverted and where it could be reclaimed. The next step is implementing what I call time congruence, ensuring that your calendar reflects your claimed priorities rather than contradicting them. If you say your health matters most, but your schedule shows zero time for movement or meal preparation, that's incongruence. If you say your creative projects are important, but your calendar shows no protected time for their development, that's incongruence. If you say your relationships matter, but your schedule shows only the leftover fragments of your attention directed their way, that's incongruence. Choosing yourself means ending these contradictions. This congruence is established through time blocking, the practice of predetermining where your life force will flow before external demands can claim it. Most people operate in reactive mode, responding to whatever seems most urgent in the moment, regardless of its actual importance. This guarantees that your most valuable time will be consumed by others' priorities. Instead, proactively block time for your non-negotiable activities, your strategic priorities, and your energy management before the world can make its claim on your attention. Now, the second pillar of choosing yourself, internal validation. Most people outsource their sense of worth to external sources, the approval of others, comparative achievement, material acquisition, physical appearance, social status. This creates a validation loop that can never be satisfied because it relies on constantly shifting external factors beyond your control. And in that endless seeking of outside confirmation, you surrender your power to define your own value. You become addicted to approval rather than anchored in worth. Breaking this addiction begins with a radical admission. No amount of external validation will ever create internal worth. You can receive every imaginable form of outside approval, standing ovations, material wealth, social media adoration, career advancement, relationship intensity, and still feel fundamentally inadequate if you haven't established your own unshakable sense of value. External validation is like sugar, a temporary high followed by an inevitable crash that leaves you craving more. Internal validation is like nutrition, sustained energy that doesn't require constant replenishment. This shift requires implementing what I call the validation reversal protocol, systematically transferring your validation needs from external to internal sources. This begins with validation tracking, documenting every time you seek outside confirmation of your worth. Did you check social media for responses to your post? That's external validation seeking. Did you make a decision based on anticipated approval? External validation seeking. Did you feel deflated when someone didn't acknowledge your contribution? External validation seeking. This awareness reveals how often your worth is placed in others' hands. The next step is validation redirection, creating new pathways that lead to internal rather than external sources of worth. When you catch yourself seeking outside approval, immediately implement a redirection. Ask yourself, how would I evaluate this situation if no one else ever knew about it? What would matter to me if external approval wasn't a factor? Then act on that assessment rather than the externally oriented one. This isn't about ignoring feedback, it's about ensuring that others' opinions inform your choices rather than control them. This redirection is supported by what I call worth anchoring, establishing specific, consistent practices that strengthen your connection to your inherent value rather than your conditional achievements. This might be daily journaling about qualities you appreciate in yourself, regardless of performance. It might be regular reflection on how your actions have aligned with your values, independent of results. It might be consistent acknowledgement of your growth, separate from comparative status. The specifics matter less than the consistency, creating an unbreakable habit of self-validation. The third pillar of choosing yourself is aligned action, ensuring that your behavior consistently reflects what you genuinely value rather than what you've been conditioned to pursue. Most people operate from inherited priorities, success definitions absorbed from parents, status markers adopted from peers, aspiration templates downloaded from culture. They work relentlessly toward goals that were never truly theirs, then wonder why achievement leaves them empty. True alignment begins with a courageous question. If no one would be impressed, disappointed, or even aware of my choices, what would I actually want? This question initiates what I call the alignment audit, a systematic examination of your current pursuits, assessing which ones emerge from authentic desire and which ones stem from external expectation. This isn't about abandoning all responsibilities or obligations, it's about bringing consciousness to why you're engaged with them. Are you advancing in your career because the path genuinely resonates, or because success in that domain brings status? Are you in your relationship because the connection nourishes you, or because being partnered meets social expectations? Clarity precedes alignment. Once you've distinguished between authentic and inherited priorities, you implement what I call incremental realignment, gradually shifting your energy allocation to reflect your genuine values rather than adopted ones. This isn't about dramatic life upheaval, it's about consistent redirection. Can you reduce time spent on status-driven activities by 10% and redirect it to genuine passions? Can you decrease energy invested in impressing others by 10% and reinvest it in meaningful contribution? Small shifts compound over time, transforming your life's direction without destabilizing its foundation. This realignment is reinforced through what I call authentic decision-making, applying a new filter to each choice you face. Instead of asking, "What should I do?" which invokes external standards, you ask, "What would be most aligned with who I truly am?" This isn't selfish, it's clarifying. It doesn't ignore impact on others, it simply ensures that your considerations stem from internal congruence rather than external appeasement. When you consistently make decisions from alignment rather than accommodation, your life naturally reorganizes around your authentic self. The fourth pillar of choosing yourself is boundary mastery, then establishing clear delineations between what is and isn't acceptable and how you're treated, how your time is used, how your energy is engaged. Most people have weak or inconsistent boundaries because they fear the consequences of enforcement, disapproval, conflict, rejection, abandonment. But without clear boundaries, choosing yourself remains an abstract concept rather than a lived reality. You can't prioritize your well-being while allowing continuous encroachment on your physical, emotional, and energetic space. Boundary mastery begins with boundary clarity, precisely defining what is and isn't acceptable in specific domains of your life. Most boundary violations occur not because others are intentionally disrespectful, but because your limits haven't been clearly established, even in your own mind. What behaviors from others are unacceptable in your relationships? What requests for your time warrant an automatic no? What topics of conversation are off limits? What types of treatment will you no longer tolerate? Vague boundaries can't be effectively maintained. Once boundaries are clearly defined, you implement what I call graduated response protocols, predetermined reactions to boundary violations that escalate appropriately based on severity and frequency. This removes the need for in-the-moment decisions, which are often compromised by emotional reactions or conflict avoidance. Minor violations might warrant a clear verbal redirection. Repeated violations might require temporary distance. Severe or persistent violations might necessitate relationship reevaluation. Having these responses predetermined transforms boundary enforcement from a hesitant possibility to an automatic certainty. The final component of boundary mastery is what I call discomfort capacity. Developing your ability to tolerate the inevitable tension that arises when you maintain boundaries with someone who's accustomed to their absence. Most boundary erosion happens not because the boundaries themselves aren't clear, but because enforcing them creates momentary discomfort that feels more immediate than the long-term pain of boundary violation. Building capacity for this discomfort through graduated exposure and conscious reframing transforms boundary maintenance from an anxiety-producing confrontation to a natural expression of self-respect. Now that you understand the 4 pillars of choosing yourself, let's talk about implementation. Because information without application creates knowledge, but application without integration creates temporary change. True transformation requires both: clear understanding of principles followed by systematic implementation, followed by complete integration into your identity. And that process begins with what I call the self-choice protocol, a structured approach to rebuilding your relationship with yourself from the foundation up. The protocol begins with the permission ceremony, a formal, intentional release of seeking external authorization for your authentic expression. This isn't a metaphor, it's a specific practice. Create a physical representation of the permission you've been waiting for. Write it on paper, create a symbolic object, design a personal ritual. Then consciously release the need for that external validation. This might sound ceremonial, but psychological research confirms that symbolic acts create powerful cognitive shifts. By physically representing the release of external permission, you catalyze internal authorization. The next step is identity reclamation, systematically reconnecting with aspects of yourself that have been suppressed, neglected, or abandoned in the process of adapting to others' expectations. This isn't about discovering who you are. It's about remembering who you've always been beneath the adaptations. What were you naturally drawn to before you learned to seek approval? What energized you before you became concerned with others' validation? What did you value before you absorbed external priorities? These aren't nostalgic questions, they're archaeological, excavating your authentic self from beneath accumulated social conditioning. This reclamation is supported by what I call desire distinction, learning to differentiate between conditioned wants and authentic desires. Conditioned wants emerge from social programming, comparison, and external validation seeking. They're often accompanied by justifications, explanations, and defensive reasoning. Authentic desires emerge from internal alignment. They're accompanied by a sense of resonance, energy, and clear knowing, even without logical justification. Developing the ability to distinguish between these 2 types of wanting is essential for choosing yourself rather than choosing the self others have constructed for you. The next phase of the protocol is what I call sovereign decision architecture, redesigning how you make choices to prioritize internal alignment over external approval. This begins with decision decontamination, creating space between external input and your choice-making process. When facing a significant decision, implement a mandatory pause before seeking others' opinions. Connect with your own knowing first. Document it clearly, and only then selectively seek input from trusted sources. This ensures that external perspectives inform your decisions rather than supplant your own discernment. This architecture includes validation-free zones, specific areas of your life where you completely remove the possibility of external approval or validation. These might be creative pursuits that nobody else sees, physical practices with no performance metrics, learning endeavors with no credential attached, or personal rituals with no social component. These zones aren't minor indulgences. They're training grounds, spaces where you practice connecting with pure internal motivation and satisfaction without the possibility of external reward or recognition. The protocol continues with relationship recalibration, systematically reassessing and reorganizing your connections based on whether they support or undermine your self-choice. This isn't about categorically ending relationships. It's about consciously redesigning them. Which connections consistently affirm your authentic expression? Which ones reflexively pressure you toward accommodation or conformity? Which ones respect your boundaries, and which ones regularly test or violate them? These patterns reveal which relationships support your sovereignty and which ones require restructuring. This recalibration begins with what I call energy mapping, tracking how different interactions affect your vital force. After each significant engagement with someone, document your energy level, emotional state, and clarity of thought. Does this connection consistently leave you energized, clear, and expanded, or depleted, confused, and contracted? This isn't subjective impression, it's empirical data collection, creating an objective record of how each relationship impacts your capacity to maintain self-connection. This data doesn't dictate decisions, but it provides essential information for conscious recalibration. Based on this mapping, implement what I call strategic proximity, intentionally adjusting the closeness, frequency, and nature of different connections. Some relationships may need more clearly defined boundaries. Others may need reduced time allocation. Some may need context limitations, interacting in certain settings but not others. And yes, some may need to be released entirely if they consistently undermine your self-choice despite reasonable adjustments. This isn't cold calculation, it's conscious curation, ensuring that your relational environment supports rather than sabotages your sovereignty. An essential component of choosing yourself is what I call comfort with consequence, developing the emotional capacity to withstand the inevitable results of prioritizing your authentic path over others' expectations. When you truly choose yourself, some people will disapprove, some opportunities will be lost, some connections will weaken or dissolve. This isn't a possibility, it's a certainty. And your willingness to accept these consequences is directly proportional to your capacity for genuine self-choice. You cannot simultaneously prioritize external approval and internal alignment. Building this capacity begins with consequence forecasting, explicitly identifying the potential outcomes of specific self-choices, both positive and negative. If you establish this boundary, what might you lose? If you pursue this authentic interest, who might disapprove? If you allocate your time according to your actual priorities, which obligations will go unfulfilled? This isn't pessimistic projection, it's strategic preparation, developing specific responses to anticipated consequences rather than being blindsided by them, which often triggers retreat back into accommodating patterns. This preparation is reinforced through what I call resilience architecture, systematically building your capacity to withstand the discomfort of others' responses to your self-choice. This includes developing specific coping strategies for common reactions, scripts for addressing disapproval, practices for processing rejection sensitivity, techniques for managing the guilt that often accompanies boundary establishment. This architecture doesn't eliminate the discomfort of consequences, it makes them navigable rather than overwhelming. An often overlooked aspect of choosing yourself is what I call containment capacity. Your ability to hold your aspirations, your processes, and your growth within yourself, rather than constantly seeking external acknowledgement or validation. Most people habitually externalize their evolution, immediately sharing insights, broadcasting goals, publicizing progress. This creates dependency on others' responses and makes your development vulnerable to external judgment, which often leads to premature abandonment or unhelpful modification of authentic directions. Building containment capacity begins with what I call sacred secrecy, intentionally keeping certain aspects of your journey private, not from shame or fear, but from reverence. Some goals, some practices, some revelations are too tender, too potent, or too personal to be exposed to casual observation or uninvested feedback. Protecting these elements isn't about hiding, it's about honoring, creating a sacred container where your most authentic expressions can develop fully before facing the elements of external opinion. This capacity is strengthened through what I call validation delay. Intentionally postponing the sharing of accomplishments, insights, or creations that would typically trigger immediate seeking of external approval. When you complete something meaningful, practice waiting 24 hours before sharing it with anyone. When you reach a significant milestone, wait a week before announcing it. When you have a powerful insight, allow it to integrate fully before seeking confirmation. This practice builds your validation muscle, your ability to find completion within yourself rather than through others' responses. A crucial element of choosing yourself that most approaches completely overlook is what I call success integration. Developing the capacity to fully inhabit your achievements, growth, and expansion without triggering unconscious self-sabotage. Most people focus entirely on attaining success without developing the internal infrastructure to sustain it. Then, when advancement arrives, it creates psychological vertigo, a disorienting gap between their established self-concept and their new reality. This gap often triggers retreat to familiar limitation. Success integration begins with what I call identity expansion work, systematically enlarging your self-concept to include greater achievement, impact, and recognition before they manifest externally. This isn't visualization, it's psychological preparation, gradually incorporating the internal shifts that success will require so they don't all have to happen simultaneously. How would someone operating at your next level think? How would they handle challenges? How would they relate to feedback? How would they carry themselves? Rehearsing these shifts in advance reduces their disorienting impact when they become necessary. This integration is supported by what I call anchored celebration, marking achievements in ways that strengthen your connection to your own agency rather than external validation. Most celebration in our culture is externally oriented, focused on recognition, comparison, or status markers. Anchored celebration instead emphasizes your own growth trajectory, the qualities that facilitated your achievement, and the alignment between your actions and your values. This isn't diminishing accomplishment, it's deepening it, connecting success to internal development rather than external comparison. Now let's address one of the most significant barriers to choosing yourself, what I call the worthiness gap, the unconscious belief that choosing yourself requires justification through extraordinary accomplishment, exceptional circumstance, or unusual qualification. Most people postpone self-choice until they've reached some imagined threshold of achievement, contribution, or special circumstance that would earn them the right to prioritize their authentic path. But this approach fundamentally misunderstands the nature of worthiness. Worthiness isn't earned, it's inherent. You don't become worthy of choosing yourself through achievement, qualification, or extraordinary circumstance. You are already worthy by virtue of your existence. your right to prioritize your authentic expression, to allocate your life force according to your values, to establish boundaries around your being. These aren't privileges to be earned through exceptional performance. They're birthrights to be reclaimed regardless of external metrics or comparative standing. Waiting to qualify for self-choice perpetuates the very external validation seeking you're trying to transcend. Closing this worthiness gap begins with what I call reference reorientation, consciously redirecting your attention from external achievement comparisons to internal alignment measurements. Instead of asking, "Have I accomplished enough to justify choosing myself?" you ask, "Am I living in alignment with what matters most to me?" Instead of, "Do others believe I've earned the right to prioritize my authentic path?" you ask, "Am I honoring the gift of my limited time here?" This shift isn't semantic, it's foundational, transferring the authority for your worth from external metrics to internal congruence. This reorientation is reinforced through what I call the intrinsic worth practice, regularly connecting with the non-conditional aspects of your value that exist completely independent of performance, achievement, or external validation. This might be daily reflection on qualities you embody regardless of production, your capacity for compassion, your unique perspective, your commitment to growth. It might be regular acknowledgement of how your mere existence has impacted others in ways you'll never fully know. The specific practice matters less than its regularity, creating an unbreakable habit of connecting with your inherent rather than earned value. Another significant barrier to choosing yourself is what I call productivity confusion, mistaking perpetual busyness and achievement for authentic self-expression. Many high performers believe they're choosing themselves because they're pursuing goals with intensity and focus. But upon deeper examination, they discover that their ambitions are often driven by external validation seeking, comparative achievement, or avoidance of deeper questions about meaning and purpose. True self-choice isn't about doing more, it's about ensuring that what you do emerges from genuine alignment rather than conditioned striving. Clarifying this distinction requires what I call the motivation audit, systematically examining the underlying drivers of your various pursuits. For each significant goal or activity in your life, ask, "Would I still pursue this if no one else ever knew about it? Would this still matter to me if it generated no status, recognition, or external validation? Would I choose this direction if I trusted that my worth was completely unrelated to my achievement in this domain?" These questions don't invalidate externally visible accomplishment. They simply ensure that it stems from authentic desire rather than approval seeking. Based on this audit, implement what I call motivation refinement, consciously shifting the primary driver of your pursuits from external validation to internal alignment. This doesn't necessarily change what you do. It transforms why and how you do it. You might continue in the same career path, but with focus redirected from status attainment to meaningful contribution. You might maintain similar health practices, but with emphasis shifted from appearance optimization to energy enhancement. You might engage in the same creative pursuits, but with attention transferred from external reception to internal resonance. This refinement is supported by what I call enoughness practice, regularly connecting with the sufficiency of who you are and what you have right now, independent of future achievement or acquisition. This isn't complacency, it's groundedness, establishing that your worth isn't contingent on perpetual forward motion or continuous improvement. You can simultaneously appreciate your current state and aspire to growth, just as you can both love someone completely and support their evolution. Enoughness doesn't diminish ambition, it purifies it, ensuring that it stems from wholeness rather than perceived deficiency. Let's address another common barrier to choosing yourself: the fear of selfishness, the concern that prioritizing your authentic path equates to disregarding others' needs or abandoning your responsibilities. This fear keeps many people locked in patterns of chronic self-abandonment, constantly placing others' preferences above their own boundaries, others' expectations above their own values, others' agendas above their own priorities. But this approach fundamentally misunderstands the relationship between self-honor and service to others. Choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's sustainable. You cannot consistently give what you don't possess. You cannot reliably offer what you haven't developed. You cannot effectively serve from a place of depletion, resentment, or martyrdom. True service, the kind that genuinely enhances others rather than subtly diminishing them through obligation or unconscious manipulation, emerges from wholeness, not sacrifice. It flows from abundance, not scarcity. It expands from fulfillment, not deficit. By choosing yourself, you become capable of authentic contribution rather than depleted accommodation. This understanding is reinforced through what I call oxygen mask principle, recognizing that your ability to support others is directly proportional to your own well-being and alignment. Just as airplane safety instructions direct you to secure your own oxygen mask before assisting others, life requires that you establish your own foundation before attempting to strengthen others. This isn't sequential selfishness, me first, then maybe you if there's time. It's strategic sustainability, ensuring that your capacity to contribute remains renewable rather than depleting into inevitable collapse or unconscious resentment. Implementing this principle begins with what I call giving from overflow, ensuring that your contributions to others come from genuine surplus rather than core resource depletion. This requires honest assessment. Is this generosity coming from authentic abundance, or is it depleting my essential reserves? Is this service flowing from real desire to contribute, or from guilt, obligation, or fear of disapproval? Is this assistance expanding my capacity through meaningful connection or contracting it through boundary violation? True giving enhances rather than diminishes the giver. A crucial but often overlooked aspect of choosing yourself is what I call emotional sovereignty, developing complete ownership of your internal state rather than outsourcing its regulation to external circumstances or others' behavior. Most people live in what psychologists call an external locus of control, believing that their feelings are determined by their environment. You made me angry. This situation is making me anxious. Their approval makes me confident. This perspective leaves you perpetually vulnerable to emotional hijacking because any trigger can supposedly make you feel something you can't handle. The alternative is developing an internal locus of control, recognizing that while you don't choose your initial emotional reactions, you do choose your relationship to them. No person or situation makes you feel anything. They provide stimulus to which you have conditioned responses, and those responses can be recognized, understood, and ultimately redirected. This isn't about suppressing emotions. It's about owning them, engaging with even difficult feelings from a position of agency rather than victimhood. This sovereignty is developed through what I call emotional differentiation, the practice of distinguishing between the initial emotional response that arises automatically and your chosen relationship to that response. You cannot control whether anger, hurt, or insecurity initially emerges in certain situations, but you can control whether you identify with that emotion, amplify it through your thinking, and act from its directives. This distinction creates essential space between stimulus and response, the space where authentic choice lives. This capacity is further strengthened through what I call emotional literacy training, developing increasingly precise language for your emotional experience. Most people operate with crude emotional categories: good, bad, stressed, fine. This lack of precision makes emotions seem more overwhelming and less manageable than they actually are. Stressed might actually be anticipatory anxiety, or cognitive overload, or social overstimulation, or physical fatigue, each requiring different responses. The more accurately you can name what you're feeling, the more effectively you can work with it rather than being controlled by it. Another essential aspect of choosing yourself is what I call decision sovereignty, taking complete ownership of your choices rather than implicitly or explicitly outsourcing them to others' expectations, social norms, or projected consequences. Most people don't actually decide. They defer, habitually looking outside themselves for confirmation, permission, or direction before determining their course. This pattern creates a life that's technically self-directed, but fundamentally externally orchestrated, a series of choices that reflect others' values more than your own. Reclaiming decision sovereignty begins with what I call the decision origin shift, moving from "what should I do" to "what do I want to do?" The first question invokes external standards and expectations. The second initiates internal connection and clarity. This isn't about ignoring impact or responsibility. It's about starting from self-connection rather than self-abandonment. You can consider others' needs, practical constraints, and potential consequences while still maintaining your position as the primary authority in your own life rather than its secretary. This shift is supported by what I call decision hygiene, creating specific practices that maintain the clarity of your choice-making process. This includes regular digital detoxes that reduce external input saturation. It includes pre-decision meditation or journaling that connects you with your own knowing before seeking outside perspectives. It includes selective counsel, intentionally limiting whose input you consider based on their demonstrated respect for your sovereignty rather than their tendency to impose their preferences. These practices don't isolate you. They insulate your discernment from excessive external influence. A critical component of choosing yourself that most approaches completely overlook is what I call legacy orientation, making decisions based not on immediate comfort or approval, but on the story you're writing with your life. Most people evaluate choices through a narrow temporal window, considering only short-term consequences, immediate feedback, or current cultural norms. This perspective naturally prioritizes accommodation over authenticity, since the former usually produces less friction in the immediate term, even as it creates profound regret in the longer view. Legacy orientation expands this decision-making window, evaluating choices not just from the perspective of immediate impact, but from the vantage point of your future self looking back. Ask yourself, at the end of my life, what will I wish I had prioritized? What version of my story will I want to tell? What choices will I respect myself for having made, regardless of their immediate reception? This temporal shift often reveals that the practical choice in the short term becomes the impractical one in the larger context of a life fully lived. This perspective is reinforced through what I call hero exercise, identifying someone whose life path you deeply admire, not for their achievements, but for their alignment, their integrity, their congruence between values and actions. Then specifically examine, when did they choose themselves despite external pressure? When did they maintain their course despite opposition? When did they honor their truth despite significant potential consequences? These examples aren't meant for imitation, they're meant for permission, evidence that the path of authentic self-choice, while rarely easy, leads to lives of meaning and impact rather than isolation or irrelevance. Now let's talk about implementation on a practical level, because information without application is just entertainment, and you didn't come here to be entertained, you came to transform your life. Starting today, you're going to implement what I call the Sovereignty Protocol, a 7-day sequence of specific practices designed to fundamentally shift your relationship with yourself, not through affirmations or visualizations, but through concrete actions that systematically dismantle external dependency and establish internal authority. Day 1 begins with the permission release, a full day focused on noticing and interrupting your habitual patterns of seeking external authorization for your choices. Every time you catch yourself thinking, I should ask someone what they think before I decide, pause and redirect, what do I think? What feels aligned for me? Every time you find yourself checking for validation before proceeding, interrupt the pattern. My alignment is the primary validation. This isn't about ignoring valuable input. It's about establishing your own authority as the primary reference point rather than an afterthought. Day 2 focuses on boundary initiation, implementing at least one clear, specific boundary in each major domain of your life. Not vague intentions, but concrete delineations. In your work, I will not check email before 10 a.m. In your relationships, I will not engage in conversations that involve criticizing absent others. In your self-care, I will not schedule meetings during my designated restoration time. These aren't arbitrary restrictions, they're intentional demarcations, clear signals to yourself and others that your time, energy, and presence have value that you're committed to honoring. Day 3 introduces time reclamation, systematically eliminating low-return investments of your life force and redirecting that energy toward authentic priorities. Identify at least 3 regular time allocations that drain more energy than they return. Mindless social media scrolling, obligatory social engagements maintained out of habit rather than genuine connection, entertainment choices that numb rather than nourish. Replace these with equivalent time investments in activities that genuinely energize, develop, or fulfill you. Not as a reward for productivity, but as an essential redistribution of your most precious resource. Day 4 centers on voice activation, deliberately expressing your authentic perspective in situations where you would typically remain silent, defer, or adapt your viewpoint to match the prevailing opinion. This isn't about argumentativeness. It's about presence, allowing your genuine thoughts and feelings to have expression rather than perpetually filtering them through anticipated reception. Start in low-risk contexts and progressively expand to more challenging ones, noticing how the mere act of authentic expression strengthens your connection to your own authority regardless of how your perspective is received. Day 5 focuses on desire excavation, systematically reconnecting with genuine wants that have been buried beneath layers of practicality, responsibility, or others' expectations. This begins with the completion of a simple but revealing sentence stem. If no one would judge me, I would. Complete this prompt at least 25 times, writing without censorship, without rationalization, without practical consideration. This isn't a commitment to act on every desire, it's an archaeology of authentic wanting, excavating genuine desires from beneath accumulated social conditioning and practical compromise. Day 6 introduces sovereign scheduling, redesigning your calendar to reflect your actual priorities rather than default obligations. This isn't about abandoning responsibilities, it's about conscious allocation, ensuring that your highest values receive prime energetic real estate rather than leftover fragments. Block time for what matters most before responding to external demands. Schedule restoration before obligation. Allocate energy toward growth areas before maintenance tasks. This isn't selfishness, it's stewardship, taking full ownership of your limited time rather than allowing it to be claimed by default external pressures. Day 7 culminates with integration practice, bringing conscious awareness to the shifts that have occurred through the previous 6 days of implementation. This is not abstract reflection, but concrete documentation. What specific decisions did you make differently? What particular boundaries did you establish and maintain? What tangible redistribution of your time and energy did you implement? This documentation isn't celebration, it's consolidation, creating clear evidence of change that your mind can reference when old patterns attempt to reassert themselves. As you complete this initial protocol, understand that choosing yourself isn't a one-time event. It's an ongoing practice. What you've done is establish a new operating system, one based on internal congruence rather than external approval, authentic expression rather than habitual adaptation, conscious choice rather than reactive accommodation. This foundation doesn't eliminate challenges or remove the pull of old patterns. What it does is establish a clear alternative, a tangible experience of what alignment feels like compared to the familiar comfort of accommodation. The key to sustaining this shift is what I call intentional identity reinforcement, consistently acting as if you're already the person who naturally chooses themselves without hesitation or apology. This isn't pretense, it's pathway creation. Neurologically establishing new default responses through deliberate repetition. Each time you honor a boundary despite discomfort, Each time you express a perspective despite potential disagreement, each time you allocate time according to genuine priority rather than external pressure, you strengthen neural pathways that make self-choice increasingly automatic rather than effortful. This reinforcement is supported by what I call regression recovery, specific practices that accelerate your return to alignment when you inevitably slip into old patterns of external validation seeking, people-pleasing, or self-abandonment. The goal isn't perfection, it's resilience, the ability to recognize regression quickly, respond to it effectively, and return to alignment with minimal delay. This recovery isn't failure, it's integration. Each return to self-choice after temporary regression actually strengthens your foundation rather than weakening it. The recovery process begins with recognition, developing heightened awareness of your specific regression indicators. These aren't random, they're consistent. How does your body feel when you're abandoning yourself? What thoughts typically accompany external validation seeking? What emotional signals indicate boundary compromise? By becoming intimately familiar with these early warning signs, you catch regression in its initial stages before it gains momentum, making redirection significantly easier and more effective. Once recognized, implement what I call pattern interruption. Specific practices that break the neurological momentum of old habits before they fully reestablish themselves. This might be physical, changing location, altering posture, engaging in brief movement; cognitive, reciting a predetermined phrase that reinforces your sovereignty; or procedural, implementing a mandatory pause before responding to demands or requests. The specific interruption matters less than its immediacy, creating space between trigger and habitual response where conscious choice can reemerge. After interruption comes realignment, deliberate reconnection with your authentic values, priorities, and boundaries before determining your next action. This isn't complicated, it's clarifying. A simple but powerful question. What would honoring myself look like in this situation? Not what's easiest, not what would avoid conflict, not what others expect, but what would constitute genuine self-respect in this specific context? This question reestablishes internal authority as your primary reference point rather than defaulting to external expectations during moments of uncertainty or pressure. This realignment is reinforced through what I call evidence collection, systematically documenting every instance, however small, where you successfully chose yourself despite the pull of old patterns. Did you maintain a boundary despite discomfort? Evidence. Did you express an authentic perspective despite potential disagreement? Evidence. Did you allocate time according to genuine priority rather than external pressure? Evidence. This collection isn't self-congratulation. It's strategic reinforcement, creating tangible proof of your capacity for sovereignty that contradicts the familiar internal narrative of inevitable accommodation. As you implement these practices consistently, something remarkable happens. Choosing yourself transitions from conscious effort to natural expression. What initially required deliberate override of conditioned responses gradually becomes your default orientation. You don't have to remind yourself to check internal alignment before making decisions. It becomes your automatic first reference. You don't have to force yourself to maintain boundaries. They feel like natural extensions of your self-respect. You don't have to convince yourself that your priorities deserve time allocation. Scheduling them first becomes obvious rather than radical. And as this shift solidifies, you'll notice something even more profound. The feared consequences of choosing yourself rarely materialize in the ways you anticipated. Yes, some people may express disappointment when you maintain boundaries. Some opportunities aligned with others' expectations rather than your authentic path may be declined. Some relationships based primarily on your accommodation may require renegotiation or release. But these adjustments, while sometimes uncomfortable, create space for something far more valuable. Connections based on who you truly are, rather than who you pretend to be. You're standing at the threshold of a life where external validation is no longer your primary fuel, where others' expectations no longer override your internal knowing, where perpetual accommodation is no longer your default response to every request or expectation. This transformation doesn't happen overnight, but it does happen, choice by choice, boundary by boundary, priority by priority, until the person who once required permission to exist becomes someone who grants that permission to themselves without hesitation or apology. Not from arrogance, but from authenticity. Not from selfishness, but from sovereignty. So I challenge you, starting right now, stop waiting for permission to become who you already are. Stop seeking validation for choices that require only your own alignment. Stop deferring your authentic expression until some imagined future moment when external conditions finally grant you authorization to fully exist. That moment will never arrive through waiting. It can only be claimed through deciding. Not someday, not when circumstances align, not when resistance disappears, but today, in this moment, through the revolutionary act of choosing yourself first. The choice is simple, but profound. Continue living as a supporting character in others' stories, or start writing your own. Continue fragmenting your energy across endless external demands, or start focusing it toward what genuinely matters to you. Continue seeking validation from sources that can never provide lasting fulfillment, or start generating that fulfillment through alignment with your own truth. It's not about what you do. It's about who you become in the process. Someone who no longer requires external permission to honor their own worth. The transformation begins with one decision. From this moment forward, I am the primary authority in my own life. My alignment is my most reliable guide. My boundaries are expressions of my self-respect. My time allocations reflect my authentic values. My voice carries my genuine perspective. This isn't arrogance, it's alignment. It's not selfishness, it's sovereignty. It's not isolation, it's integration, bringing all parts of yourself into congruence, rather than sacrificing pieces to maintain external approval or avoid potential conflict. So walk differently from this point forward. Choose differently. Speak differently. Not from rebellion, not from defiance, not from the wounds of past abandonment, but from the clarity of knowing exactly who you are and what matters most to you. The world doesn't change when you choose yourself. Your experience of it transforms completely. Not because external circumstances magically align with your preferences, but because you no longer require that alignment for your fulfillment. You found the unshakable center from which all meaningful contribution, authentic connection, and genuine impact emerge. Not the self that's constructed to please others, but the self that exists beyond all construction, waiting only for your permission to fully live. And if that permission has finally been granted, subscribe, because living from that place is just the beginning.